Hi, yeah, it's Lee Bryan again from Arcus Compliance. Been a while since we've done one of these videos, but I think that given the current state of play with increased regulations, enforcements that we're seeing around Europe, is probably a good time to start getting a little bit of content created and getting it out there to try and help some of these smaller brands stay relevant, stay compliant, and stay in the market. I get asked an awful lot of questions, particularly having recently released the book for the vape guys. One of the things that I get asked for more often than not is how did I get into the industry and why regulatory compliance? And I stumbled into it really. I spent most of my career working in the luxury leather industry and the chemical side of the luxury leather industry, mainly in Europe, Spain, Italy, Holland. And at the time, my wife at the time didn't want to move to Italy, so I left that job and we moved back to the UK. Now, there's no leather industry to speak of in the UK, certainly not the area that I was looking at. So I was looking around to find out what the buzz industry was at the time, where I could earn a salary similar to what I'd been used to. And obviously, e-cigarettes back in 2013 was very much the boom industry at the time, and certainly would pay what I was looking for. So I didn't come into the industry with any preconceived ideas or to be a crusader or at all, to be honest. I got into the industry purely for financial reasons. But what happened was, as soon as I got into the industry and I saw the potential or the harm reduction potential that this industry had, it did make me somewhat of a crusader, I have to say. Having lost my dad and paternal grandparents to smoking related illnesses, it made me realize that had this tech been around 20, 30 years ago when we lost those family members, that they might have been saved. Really, what I'm doing in the industry now is trying to prop up the mum and pop operators in our industry. You know, the pioneers of the vape industry were the entrepreneurs. They were the guys who were market traders or window cleaners that had a similar story to me, that had lost people like through combustible tobacco and smoking related illnesses, and they were passionate about it. So there wasn't necessarily from a business background per se, or a technical background or scientific background. They were just passionate. They were driven by passion. So what we try to do now is to facilitate those guys, to enable them to continue to be entrepreneurs and come up with the ideas and the products, and then give them the guidance and the help they need to actually ensure that those products are compliant. I realize that I've gone a little bit off track there in terms of why I came into this industry or how I got into it. But in a nutshell, it was financial. I got two offers, one loosely in the leather industry and one from, at the time, who were the biggest e-liquid manufacturer in the world, a Chinese-based company. I came in to head up their European operation, build a brand, build their white label, and got in with them that on that level, I suppose. That was in end of 2013, and then obviously in 2014, the regulations were released with an incoming date of 2016. Upon reading the regulations, I soon realized that this particular company were very far away from being ready to run a compliant business. So I began educating myself on what needed to be done and how we could do it and how we could facilitate it, and moved to another big UK-based manufacturer, lab, and compliance company. And then I moved around to a few different places, one of the biggest retailers in the world, and I went to another compliance company. And I suppose I got a little bit disillusioned with the industry, to be honest. And I had an opportunity to buy 10 vape stores, and I was really headlong into that. And I was working with a private equity firm, and I was probably a week away from taking that and buying these stores. Prior to that, I'd left to take up a project management course and re-educate myself as a project manager. And when I left the consulting role that I was doing with a compliance company, one of the big brands in the industry at the time, big device brands. He said to me, if you set up your own shop, we'll come with you. And I thought, okay, it's not really where I was going to go. I wasn't planning on being in compliance for the rest of my life. But it was essentially, it was a bit of a safety net. And lo and behold, a week before, I think it was actually 2 days before we were due to sign the deal with the private equity firm to buy these 10 stores, they pulled out. So I was left, okay, with a reasonable contract from a big device manufacturer, and had set up the basis of a business just to tick along. But it immediately led me to realize that, okay, I'm doing compliance for the time being. But I stuck with it purely out of necessity. I was here in mid Wales, not where I'm from, and I stayed here to be a dad to my son. And I suppose the limited opportunities and the need to be present for my son growing up led me just, I dug in and pushed forward with building Arcus. And what we'd done differently, we'd started the business just after the TPD had come in, and nobody wanted to speak about compliance. Everybody sort of either sidestepped, or they'd spent money with other companies, been burned in terms of the amount of money they'd spent and the service they'd received. So it was really difficult for us to begin with. We had one client, and fortunately that paid the bills, and we focused on service. We focused on old school customer service, delivering on what we'd promised, and just banging down doors. Every single expo we would go to, we would talk to clients or talk to prospects, and our reputation preceded us for delivering on what we promised. And we'd pick up one client, then another client, and we grew. I think by the end of the first year, we had a few clients, and the second year it grew, and we doubled in turnover every year, to the point where we are now. We're a multi-million pound turnover company with 12 staff, some based in the States, some based in Europe, some based in the UK. And we've grown now into not only a specialist, a regulatory compliance specialist for novel nicotine, but also we've pivoted into other industries, pretty much because of our clients who have come to us and said, look, you've done a sterling job for us on our vape products or our nic pouch products, and we don't trust anybody else to handle our compliance. Can you do cannabis compliance? Can you do CBD submissions for novel foods? Or can you do our regulatory license filing in the States for a manufacturing plant or a retailer? So we pivoted towards cannabis, and then we had clients who moved into, obviously, the med device side of the vape industry. We're preparing dossiers and submissions for their vape devices to be a med device in the UK. And latterly, we had one client who sold their vape factory in China for tens of millions, and he bought an adult toy, a sex toy factory, and said, we want you to handle our compliance in this. And obviously we thought, okay, potentially. And obviously when we looked at the baseline compliance of that, it's very similar, a lot of similarities between, well, certainly on the electronic side of it, as there is in adult toys. So we see the similarities with the adult toys, particularly they're currently unregulated or don't have a category specific regulation. They're caught under a few of the catch-alls and generic regulations for Europe. Nonetheless, we work on a few projects and clients for that side of things, and are growing across those new industries as well. We often get asked, and I think this is where a lot of our value to our clients is the complexities and the technical nature of regulatory compliance. Now, I'm not a technician, I'm not a subject matter expert or anything like that. I'm very commercial. I understand the needs for regulatory compliance, not necessarily the technical side. And thankfully, I've got a very strong team behind me that are able to handle the technical side of it very effectively. I mentioned that the pioneers of our industry are perhaps more like myself than the technical guys or the scientific guys. So the need for them to have support in this is greater than perhaps in other industries. And I think that's really where we've succeeded, where others haven't. When I first looked at how we're going to actually do a transaction or how we're going to actually deal with clients, we looked at one of two ways, one being project and ad hoc, another being retained. And I genuinely thought that we would just be doing ad hoc business in the main for most of our clients. And going back to 2017 when we started. And our first client was a retained client, and the next client came on as a retained client, and it just seemed to go like that. And what we found, that essentially what they wanted is the peace of mind. They wanted to be able to say, "This is our products. These are the markets we're selling into. Can you just take care of it for us?" We became very much a full service, like an external compliance department, if you like, a third party supplier, but very integrated. And so we'd hold the hands of the clients and say, think about if you're going into this market, you're going to need this, you're going to need these SDS, you're going to need your labeling in this particular language or languages. And that's really what I think helped people, because the TPD for the Tobacco Products Directive, for example, is a European directive. And then what happens is that the member states would transpose it into local law. So there's a local transposition of the TPD in every country that it affects. So if you're a US-based brand and you've got to, what at the time was 28 countries when the UK was in it, and now 27 plus the UK. So you've got all of these different transpositions, and some of them, okay, you can't go below the requirements within the Tobacco Products Directive, but you could gold plate. So certain countries have banned certain chemicals, and you can go a certain route with some countries and not with others. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables. And a lot of our guys, a lot of our clients, and a lot of the pioneers of the industry they're essentially marketing guys or salespeople, and they're great at developing brands and they're great at making sales. But when it comes to looking at and monitoring all of these potential changes and differences across all of the EU, it's not something that they excel at. And a lot of the time they are made up of salespeople and marketing people and not much else. So they don't have an internal compliance department. Some of them could afford it. They could certainly afford to actually implement a compliance department, probably not as cost effectively as what we can provide the same service for, which again, I think is another marker of our success. But you're dealing with not just the TPD, there's all of these other regulations that stack up against it, whether it's the CLP, which is the classification, labeling and packaging. If there's device, you've got the electrical side of things, CE, WE for the waste. But there's also all these other libel directives, all the surveillance and marketing directives and regulations that will all impact vape products depending on the product type. When you actually start peeling away the layers, if you like, of the onion, you're thinking, Christ, how much does this, how deep is this? How do we handle this? And I think because we've grown with the industry, we started in 2017, as I said, and the focus back then was TPD. And obviously we were looking at all of these other things as well and getting people ready for the education process of the competent authorities, if you like. Because what you have to understand is when a new piece of regulation comes in for a new market, the enforcement bodies and the competent authorities also have an education period where they're thinking, how do we do this? What do we focus on first? And so they're educating their team. So we were always ahead of the curve in that respect. So we were focusing not only on the submissions, but the product stewardship, the entire life cycle of the product. What if this happens? And the benefit of representing such a large section of the industry as we do is that when something pops up or something changes and it affects a client, we find out about it. We'll deal with the competent authority or the enforcement body, rectify it, fix anything that needs to be fixed. But what we've created is a hive mind. So what we can do is when it affects one client, we can then think, okay, which of our other clients is this going to impact? And then we can proactively make the changes before it actually impacts all of these guys. So if you were handling this yourself, i.e. not working with a compliance specialist like Arcus, you wouldn't necessarily get that smoke alarm benefit that we would have. And obviously, every single time something happened, normally we'll find out about it through scanning the horizon, if you like, on any new market changes. But sometimes the enforcement bodies, or competent authorities, are not always as competent as you would like. And they don't let anybody know, and they don't put it on their monthly or quarterly updates, newsletters. So you find out when it changes. So when it changes, we have to hustle and make sure everything or all of our clients are changed and remain ahead of the curve. In a nutshell, there is no nutshell in fairness, but there is a huge amount of data and moving parts and variables that has to be monitored. And if you're trying to do that yourself, as a vape company, as a brand owner, you need a big team. B, that team needs to have a huge amount of experience. And the fact that the vape industry is a new industry, there's not many regulatory compliance specialists out there that are available to employ that can hit the ground running. So there's a lead time. And B, and C, when you have recruited that team, it's going to be a lot more expensive than what we can do the same amount of work for, because we've actually spent an awful lot of time developing proprietary software tools to allow us to expedite a lot of the more repetitive work. I think today we've probably spent about $250,000 on developing our own proprietary tools, whether that is through submission, screening for banned substances, toxicological monographs, working with all the public PubMed databases out there that can pull in all the studies. You can never get something there that's going to be able to do that 100%. So there's a certain amount of human moderation there. So there's a big learning curve there. And then there's the post-market surveillance aspect of it, particularly around adverse events. So if there's an issue with one of your products, a consumer has a reaction or a problem, obviously you've got the yellow card system through the MHRA and all of the other European member states, but you also have an obligation to track that, have a system to track that yourself. Now, the regulation says the system needs to be appropriately robust based on the size of your company. For example, if you're just selling in the UK and you're selling 10,000 units a month, you could argue that a telephone number and a spreadsheet, so that if there was a batch failure, for example, that impacted 10% of that batch, and you had 10,000, so you had 1,000 phone calls coming in across a couple of weeks, you could argue that a telephone number and a spreadsheet to record that is fine, because it's one language, you've got a small amount of sales, that would be fine. But if you're selling across multiple member states and languages, so you might be selling UK, France, Germany, Italy, and you're selling 1 million units a month, your system, when they say appropriately robust, your system would need to be able to account for or deal with a batch failure, for example. And if that batch failure affected 10%, and you were getting 100,000 complaints or safety concerns being reported, your system would need to be able to cope with the amount plus in all of those languages. So if you've got a phone number and that person, that one person will be able to do 100,000 calls, but that one person or that phone number will need to be able to deal with those safety concern complaints or reports in all of those languages that you were selling in. And you will probably need a fair few telephone lines. So they would then say that system's not appropriately robust based on the size of your company. So you would need more of a software tool. So that's why we developed that final software tool, which was Vape Visual, which essentially sits behind their website. You use a steering mechanism within the product to say, if you feeling sick or any of the aforementioned symptoms, please visit mybrand.com/vape vigil. And then it would take you to our website or our software where you would record your safety concern in your language. So obviously it eliminates the need for any operators, the language barrier, the volume. So it can do everything. So it's very scalable. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the complexities of trying to handle your regulatory compliance obligations in-house versus using somebody like Arcus. If I had to provide an example of the biggest issues that one of our clients or one of the client prior to being our clients had faced, they had a call out of the blue from a competent authority wanting to investigate dig down into the details of their recipes, what was actually in them. Now, these guys are a global brand, only probably 80% of their revenue from one flavor. I think it was one or two flavors. And this particular investigation led them to their biggest flavor. Now, what they found out was that they hadn't screened that particular recipe for any banned substances. What happened was that obviously it got pulled by the competent authority. It was flagged in essentially because of it was a little light on recipe data, little bit light on the actual chemicals that they'd submitted. So it flagged up. So when they actually dug deep into it, this banned substance that was in there from one of their flavor houses led it to be removed from the market. Now, that whole process, bearing in mind there were only something like 600,000 a year just from that one particular product, it took them 6 months to reformulate properly and get a like-for-like product out there in the market without the banned substance. Obviously, 6 months losing 300 grand in revenue is a significant amount for some of these smaller companies. Obviously, screening is something we do without or on everything. And the consideration that you have to think about there is that Germany has a banned list. If you put it into, or the UAE, for example, they have a white list. So there's only a certain amount of chemicals that are allowed to be used. So you really do need to ensure that that's a fundamental. I'm probably going back about 4 or 5 years now, actually. This led me to realize that we need to ensure that this information's out there and available to all of these smaller operators, not just our clients. I began writing a book, which eventually was released as How Safe Is Your Vape? And I got quite a bit of kickback on that from some of the crusaders thinking that I was out there to destroy the vape industry rather than help it. Let me say that's not the case, and it was quite the opposite. But what I wanted to do was really ensure that the book, it got out there, that all of these, so that I could get it out there to these mom and pop operators that perhaps are not earning enough money from the business to pay a retained contract to us. But if they could understand what the fundamentals of compliance they really need to focus on, I developed a methodology called core compliance that focuses on 6 key areas with a lot of, if you think about bullet points within each of those core areas, that allows these guys to actually spend 15 quid, buy the book, and implement this compliance strategy internally. They can do an awful lot of it in-house. They don't need to work with, you're gonna have to spend the money on emissions testing with a third-party approved lab. But a lot of the groundwork, a lot of the grunt work can be done in-house and saving thousands and thousands of pounds. Back in 2013, 2014, a compliance strategy essentially meant in the industry, looking at who the number one player was in your region or in the world, looking at the labels and copying them. And copying at least the technical data to make them look correct. That might have worked in 2014 because the competent authorities and enforcement bodies wasn't actually looking that deep into it. Now they are, and you can't get away with that anymore. So everybody really does need to up their game and make sure that they're looking at the fundamentals They're doing what they need to do, because I genuinely believe that a diverse vape industry is good. The longer we can keep this industry out of the hands of big tobacco and diverse, the better it is. Those guys in big tobacco have had control of the industry for far too long, and they certainly would not be pushing a smoke-free generation or smoke or vaping products or nicotine pouches had Honlick not developed the electronic cigarette 20 odd years ago. So I genuinely believe that we need to do everything we possibly can as an industry to keep it diverse and keep as many different brands in the industry. And the only way we're going to do that is by making sure that these guys, or all of you, treat compliance and spend on compliance the same way that you spend on marketing. Treat compliance equally as important, and attribute a budget for your compliance globally, and annual budget in the same way that you would attribute a budget for your marketing. The issue that we've got as an industry, or the issue that these guys have got as a vape brand company, big tobacco are losing millions and millions in revenue. Smoking combustible tobacco usage rates are dropping massively across the world, not just in the UK or Europe. So they're losing revenue. And what you find is a lot of former smokers and a lot of former combustible tobacco users, they don't want anything to do with it. They know that the product's insidious. They know the companies are insidious. They want to move away to vaping products, and they want flavors. They're not interested in vaping tobacco. Let's be honest, nobody really likes the smell of stale tobacco, even tobacco smokers. So a lot of these companies that popped up, the vaping companies popped up, were coming out with fantastically original flavors and brands, and that's what captivated them. What we've found is that a lot of the big tobacco companies are out there actually lobbying, pressing buttons, testing products, outing them in the press, and some vape companies have fallen foul. There was one probably back in 2014, a massive company in the States. Their products were tested and it was published, and they went off the cliffs. They had diacetyl in there, which is a chemical which is on the banned list within TPD, and pretty much overnight they disappeared. So whilst non-compliance is not necessarily the biggest cause of companies going out of business, it is a major factor in some of the bigger brands going out of business. They hadn't set their stall out properly. They hadn't taken compliance seriously enough. And now when you combine that with the fact that the competent authorities are educated and the enforcement bodies are now stopping shipments at the border, are enforcing at a retail level, it's never been more important for brand owners to ensure that they're taking compliance more seriously than they ever have done. It's not the only cause of vape companies going out of business. I think there's a lot more brands in the marketplace than there was 5 years ago. There's a lot more illegal manufacturers and big puff devices making their way into Europe and the UK. But the idea is that as an industry, if we can ensure that all of the good actors are doing everything they can from a compliance, from a product life cycle perspective, to ensure they're doing their marketing correctly, they're not sort of child attracting product, they're dealing with age gating, they're ticking all of the boxes, and then we're calling out all of the bad actors, we'll be taken more seriously as an industry, for sure. And I say taken more seriously as an industry, not just by the consumer, not just by big tobacco, but by the governments of the day. And we've noticed in some of the initiatives we've been working on with the UKVIA and the Vape Protection Alliance that it's difficult to get the ear of the governments or local authorities because they're not necessarily taking the industry seriously. I don't think that's in part some sections of the industry, and we haven't necessarily called out the guys who are doing it wrong quickly enough. In many cases, we have, and then enforcement bodies have not done anything about it. The government announced, I think it was a £3 million budget increase for trading standards. They'd actually cut more than that over the last 10 years. So it's a bit of a drop in the ocean, but at least they're taking it seriously now and actually enforcing. So when sections of our industry do report illegal product being brought in, hopefully it will be dealt with. And we won't necessarily be tarred with that brush as the entire industry. It'll be recognized that there are swathes of the industry that are bringing in illegal product rather than as it has been. I think that early days when we first started the business, it was just, we were chasing clients without a doubt. We were chasing every piece of business. And that was in part that we didn't really have pedigree back then. It was in part that people had spent tens of thousands of pounds, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds on their regulatory submissions prior to us even starting in business and hadn't got what they'd paid for. So they were reluctant, skeptical about compliance companies. As I said earlier on, we were swimming against the tide early days, and it made us very lean. It made us very aggressive in chasing down business. And when we did win a client, we made damn sure that we delivered. We'd made damn sure that we promised that we delivered on everything we'd promised. And if you said you're going to call someone back the following day, you rang them back, even if you didn't have the information, but you let them know. So that reputation grew. And at the end of the day, people want service. Old school customer service never gets old. Delivering what you promise never gets old. We're now at the point where we're representing, I think we've got 40 odd retained clients and representing over 200 brands globally, across the Europe, Middle East, States, some in New Zealand, a little bit of work in Australia, Canada. So we've got 200 plus ad hoc. So we don't necessarily have to chase business anymore, particularly not in the vape industry. We're still very new in the cannabis, the CBD section. We're still very new in med device. And obviously the adult toy industry in itself is very new. And the fact that there's no product specific regulation at the moment, the need for compliance is not a necessity. So it's only the bigger players, the guys who are got bigger sections of the market and want to develop a more robust compliance process that would actually spend on that. So we're still chasing business in those last three industries, but business really for within the vape section or the novel nicotine. Our reputation precedes us, and I think our position, certainly in Europe, is in the top three. Yeah, you could argue that we're probably at the top of that tree. Perhaps in the States, we're probably top five. We still get a lot of business and also a lot of local licensing, particularly on the cannabis side of things. So yeah, we don't have to hustle as much for business anymore, primarily because our reputation allows us we have a decent sales funnel now. The industry changing all the time. In the 7 years that we've been in business, the regulations haven't necessarily changed. What's happened is they were always there in black and white. I mean, this is something that we've been harping on about since we started talking about CLP classifications, correct classifications, talking about your SDS, quality SDS, the need for a system to record adverse events, screening, banned substances. Nobody really wanted to listen to start with. And it was only at clients as we started doing it for them as part of their retained package. When these hammer blows landed, when the enforcement bodies essentially, as like I said, they had a learning curve. The enforcement bodies, the competent authorities had a learning curve. Once they've learned it, what's that focus? They focus on this. Once they've tidied that up, which was a lot of toxicological studies was the first thing, tox monographs that were missing, they removed those from the market. And then people are scrambling to get their tox done. Then they had bad substance screening. They wanted to investigate that. Once they've done that, they move on to the next thing. So nothing's changed, if you like, in the industry other than the fact that they've just gone from that point to that point. So things will change, the regulations, there will be new iterations of the regulation, there will be changes. So the need for all of these brands to keep an eye on regulatory compliance will be paramount going forward and probably become more. I had a saying that I used to say to my clients all the time that regulatory compliance, if you imagine it's a moving target, what you might set your stall out right and correct as of today, but in 6 months' time, it may not be. And so you need to constantly adjust and keep your eye on that target. It is definitely a moving target. And you need to ensure that you're constantly adapting and adjusting and updating to ensure that you don't get left behind. That's never going to change. Certainly not now. The industry is far too big for regulatory compliance to ever become something that nobody needs to worry about again. It will only get worse. And the need to, like I said, allocate a budget to your regulatory compliance will become more and more essential.